I was 32 when my manager told me I was the kind of person companies protect. We were standing by the copier after 7 at night, and the office smelled like burned coffee and hot toner. He had his jacket over one shoulder, and that calm voice people use when they think they're giving real wisdom. Keep your head down. Be reliable. Don't make waves. The loud ones burn out. The steady ones win. I nodded like he'd handed me a secret. I built my life around that sentence. I started showing up before sunrise often enough that the cleaning crew knew my name. I took the ugly work nobody wanted because I thought useful people got remembered. I fixed spreadsheet errors before leadership saw them. I rewrote decks for teams that got commission checks. When meetings turned political, I stayed neutral and professional. I told myself discipline looked boring from the outside. I told myself my turn would come. What I believed then was simple. If I became impossible to replace, I would become impossible to ignore. That sounded mature, responsible. It sounded safer than ambition. Ambition felt like gambling. And I had a wife, a mortgage, and a baby who woke up every 2 hours. Reliable felt like love in a button-down shirt. There were warnings, but I called them exceptions. A younger guy I trained got promoted after 1 strong quarter and a clean presentation. A woman on our team asked for a stretch role and got it while I was still keeping things stable behind her. I congratulated people and then stayed late to fix handoff notes. I called it patience. Looking back, it was fear wearing a tie. The first time I heard my name used as a compliment, it should have bothered me. "Give it to him," someone said in a meeting. "He'll handle it and won't complain." Everyone laughed, including me. I thought they respected me. I didn't hear the hidden part. He won't ask for anything back. That was the advice that failed me. Reliability wasn't the problem. It paid my bills and built trust. The problem was I treated reliability like the whole game. I confused being needed with being valued. And once the company decided I was the man who carried weight quietly, it kept handing me more weight and less future. At home, I repeated the same story with pride. I told my wife, "They trust me with everything." She smiled because she was tired and because trust sounds like progress when you're building a life from scratch. I wasn't lying to her. I was lying to myself. The truth was harder. They trusted me with messes, not momentum. I was becoming the person a company leans on when it wants stability without paying for leadership. I still remember the elevator mirror that winter. I looked older than 32. I had a good job, a solid title, and a face that already looked like it was bracing for impact. I thought that was what adulthood looked like. I didn't know I was training people to overlook me while I helped them shine. And the more I accepted that role, the harder it became to imagine asking for anything else. By my late 30s, I was the unofficial fix-it man for 3 departments and the official owner of almost nothing that advanced my career. My calendar looked full, my performance reviews were glowing, and my title barely moved. Every review sounded the same. "You're invaluable. We trust your judgment. You're a stabilizing force." I walked out of those meetings with a 3% raise and a heavier workload. One spring, the company reorganized. They brought in a new director from outside, a man 10 years younger than me with expensive shoes and a confident way of talking over people without seeming rude. I spent 2 months onboarding him. I explained our systems, our clients, our quiet disasters, and the politics nobody puts in org charts. He thanked me constantly. He also started presenting my ideas back to leadership with cleaner language and better timing. I watched executives nod at points I had made for years, and it hit me. They weren't rewarding truth. They were rewarding delivery. What I believed then was that my work would eventually speak for itself. What I understand now is that work speaks, but organizations still choose which voices get a microphone. I had built a career on competence and ignored visibility, positioning, and leverage because those things felt like self-promotion. I called them games. The people rising called them skills. The moment that should have changed me came during a quarterly review. The new director praised me in front of a vice president. "He's the backbone of this team," he said. Backbone. I smiled because it sounded important. Then the vice president said, "Great. We need him exactly where he is." They moved on to discussing who should lead a new initiative. My name wasn't mentioned once. I drove home furious and embarrassed, but even then I aimed the anger in the wrong direction. I told myself the company was blind. I told myself politics had beaten merit. There was truth in that, but not all of it. The part I didn't want to admit was that I had participated in my own invisibility. I had made myself so dependable in the engine room that nobody pictured me on the bridge. At dinner, my daughter asked why I was quiet. She was 9 and liked to line her peas in perfect rows before eating them. I told her I was tired. My wife looked at me and knew I was lying. After the kids went to bed, she said, "You work like a man who's getting promoted next month." "Are you?" I answered too fast. "It doesn't work like that." She waited a second and said, "Then why are you still doing it like it does?" I didn't have an answer. I only had a habit. And habits feel like principles when you repeat them long enough. The next morning I was back at my desk before sunrise, answering emails no one had asked me to answer yet. That's how deep the script ran. I could see the pattern and still perform it. I thought one more quarter of proving myself would make the difference. Instead, it made me easier to use and harder to move. The break didn't come from some dramatic firing or public humiliation. It came from a conference room on a Thursday in October with stale muffins on a side table and a slide deck titled Leadership Pipeline. Human Resources had invited a dozen of us to a development workshop. I almost skipped it because quarter-end reporting was behind, but my director insisted. "Good exposure," he said. A consultant in a gray blazer started asking questions that sounded soft until they landed hard. "What outcomes are you known for? Who advocates for you when you're not in the room? What strategic work have you said no to so you could keep doing operational work?" People around me answered smoothly. I realized I had no clean answers. I had tasks. I had effort. I had loyalty. I didn't have a narrative. Then she asked one question I can still hear. "Are you carrying the work that proves your value to you, but not to the people who decide your future?" The room got very quiet. I wrote it down and underlined it so hard I tore the paper. What I believed then was that fairness would eventually correct itself if I stayed consistent long enough. What I understand now is that careers don't correct themselves. They drift toward whatever pattern your behavior reinforces. Mine was clear. I rescued, absorbed, and stabilized. I never translated that into a claim on opportunity. After the workshop, I sat in my car and opened my laptop instead of driving home. I pulled up 5 years of reviews, project notes, and saved emails. I made 2 lists. On one side, I wrote everything I had done that kept the business from breaking. On the other side, I wrote what leadership actually rewarded in the people above me: revenue ownership, initiative launches, cross-team visibility, and decisions tied to money. The lists looked like 2 different careers. That night was the first time I admitted the advice had failed because I had followed it too completely. Be reliable was supposed to be a floor, not a ceiling. It was basic table stakes. I had treated it like a strategy. I didn't sleep much. I kept replaying small moments I had dismissed, the meetings where I deferred, the ideas I emailed instead of presenting, the projects I handed off once the hard part was done. I wasn't being humble. I was hiding incompetence because competence let me feel morally superior while avoiding the risk of being judged. The next day, I did something tiny that felt huge. I declined a cleanup assignment that had nothing to do with my role. I wrote, "I'm at capacity and need to stay focused on planning for next quarter's client retention work. Happy to suggest someone else." My finger hovered over send for a full minute. Then I sent it. Nobody yelled. Nobody fired me. They just assigned it to someone else. That was the moment I realized the cage wasn't locked the way I thought it was. Changing my behavior at 40 wasn't inspiring. It was awkward and embarrassing. People who tell career stories later skip that part, but that's where the real cost is. I had spent a decade training everyone around me to expect quiet compliance, and the first time I started acting differently, the room pushed back. I began with meetings. Instead of sending my thoughts afterward in perfect bullet points, I forced myself to speak in the room, even when my voice sounded tighter than I wanted. The first few times someone interrupted me, and I let it happen out of habit. Then I started finishing my point, not aggressively, just clearly. Let me finish this one thought. It felt unnatural, like writing with my left hand. I also started documenting outcomes with my name attached. Before, I'd say, "The team did it," because I thought that sounded noble. Now I said, "I led the retention model update," or "I built the process that cut response time." I still gave credit, but I stopped erasing myself. What I believed then was that naming my work made me look arrogant. What I understand now is that unnamed work gets reassigned to whoever has the strongest presence in the room. The hardest change was saying no to rescue work. That had become my identity. When a manager from another team asked if I could just clean up a reporting mess before a board meeting, every nerve in me wanted to say yes. It would have made me the hero again. Instead, I asked, "What's the business priority tied to this? And what gets deprioritized if I take it?" He looked annoyed. I felt guilty for hours. But he found another solution. At home, the shift was visible before I admitted it. I started coming upstairs before the kids were asleep. My son asked if I was sick because I was sitting on the couch at 8:30 on a weeknight. We laughed, but it hit me hard. I had been physically present in my life for years and still absent from it. My wife noticed something else too. I was angrier for a while, not at her, but in general. Boundaries pulled old resentment to the surface. Every time I declined nonsense work, I remembered all the times I had accepted it. Every time I spoke up in a meeting, I remembered years of staying quiet and then complaining in the car. It was humbling. I wasn't just changing a company dynamic. I was grieving the version of me that thought overwork would eventually be recognized as leadership. The company didn't transform overnight. Some people respected the shift, some quietly resented it, a few tested me harder, but for the first time in years, my days started aligning with the future I said I wanted, and once I stopped rescuing every problem in reach, I finally had enough oxygen to build something that looked like leadership instead of labor. That was the turning point. Not confidence, not promotion, not a big speech, just repeated discomfort. I had spent years proving I could carry weight. Now I had to prove I could direct it. The first real opportunity came disguised as a problem nobody wanted. A major client was considering leaving after a bad software rollout, and leadership was panicking because the account touched 3 regions and a lot of revenue. In the old version of my career, I would have quietly rebuilt the process and handed it off to someone with a bigger title to present. This time, I asked to lead the recovery. The room went still for half a second when I said it, not because the idea was outrageous, but because I had never asked before. My director looked surprised, then cautious. "That would be visible," he said, as if warning me. I answered, "That's the point." I got the project, but not the support I imagined. No extra headcount, no reduced workload, just more stakes and more eyes. The first week was rough. I overprepared every meeting and still left feeling exposed. I had to make decisions with incomplete data instead of waiting until everything was tidy. I had to call out delays from teams that outranked me operationally. I had to let some small fires burn so we could fix the system causing them. What I believed then was that leaders were naturally decisive. What I understand now is most people just decide while uncomfortable and learn in public. I had hidden in readiness for years because readiness let me delay judgment. This project took that excuse away. The most important moment came during a client call when an executive asked a question I couldn't answer cleanly. Old me would have talked around it, promised a follow-up, and then spent all night patching the gap. Instead, I said, "I don't have that number yet. I'll send it by 4 p.m., and I'll include the root cause so we don't repeat this." Simple, honest, direct. After the call, one of our sales leads messaged me, "Best response on that call." That tiny message mattered more than it should have. It showed me credibility wasn't built by pretending to know everything. It was built by owning the problem without performing panic. For 3 months, I lived inside that recovery. There were hard calls, bad news, and one weekend where I worked both days, but the work felt different because it was tied to an outcome I owned. When the client renewed, leadership suddenly had a new language for me. Not reliable, not backbone. They started saying he led the turnaround. The title change didn't happen immediately, and that used to be where my story would sour. But this time I wasn't waiting in silence. I scheduled a meeting, laid out the business impact, and asked directly what role and compensation should follow the scope I was already carrying. My hands were sweating under the table. I asked anyway. That conversation didn't make me a different man. It revealed the one I should have been acting like all along. I left the room without a promise, but for once I left without shame. I had made a claim on my own work. Even if they said no, they would have to say no to my face, not quietly around me. I got the promotion 6 weeks later, and for about 3 days I felt vindicated. New title, better pay, bigger office with a window that looked at the parking lot. I walked in early Monday, closed the door, and sat there longer than I needed to, just letting myself feel it. I thought, this is it. This is the part where all those years make sense. But promotions don't erase patterns, they expose them. Within a month, I was doing something dangerous, rebuilding the same old identity at a higher salary. People came to me because I could move things quickly, and the old reflex to rescue lit up again. The difference was now my mistakes scaled. If I absorbed too much, my team stalled. If I hoarded decisions because I knew the answer, I trained them to wait for me. I had spent years being the dependable individual contributor. Now I was in a role that required me to stop being the hero. What I believed then was that success would finally make me feel secure. What I understand now is security doesn't come from titles if your habits are still built on fear. I was still afraid of being seen as difficult, still afraid of disappointing people, still tempted to win approval one solved problem at a time. The correction came from a quiet moment with one of my team leads, a woman named Marisol, who had better instincts than I did on people issues. We were in a conference room after a long day, and she said, "Can I tell you something without you going corporate on me?" I laughed and told her yes. She said, You keep fixing things before we can own them. You're helping, but you're also teaching us not to lead." That sentence hit me harder than any executive feedback ever had. She was right. I had escaped one trap and started building another. I was still using usefulness to feel safe, just with a nicer title. So I changed the way I worked again. I started asking more questions and giving fewer instant solutions. I made people bring me options, not just problems. I let meetings run a little longer if it meant someone else made the call. I protected my team publicly and coached them privately. I also made sure their wins stayed attached to their names, because I knew what it cost to disappear behind group language. At home, the shift showed up in smaller ways. I wasn't checking email in the driveway anymore. I took my daughter to look at colleges and didn't spend the whole trip half present. My son asked me to help build a workbench in the garage, and I said yes without scanning my phone between steps. Those moments made me realize the career advice had failed me in more than one place. It hadn't just narrowed my work life. It had convinced me that proving myself forever was normal. I had finally moved up. Now I had to learn how to stop living like I was still trying to earn permission to exist. The strangest part of changing late is watching younger people repeat your old mistakes while they think they're being responsible. By then I was in my 50s and I could spot the pattern in 10 minutes. The smartest person in the room staying quiet, the dependable one overloaded with invisible work, the high performer waiting to be discovered. I recognized the look because I had worn it for 20 years. One afternoon, a manager on my team named Ethan came into my office with that exact look. He was sharp, loyal, and tired in a way coffee doesn't fix. He wanted advice because he'd been passed over for a strategic assignment. He had all the same evidence I used to collect: praise, trust, strong reviews, no movement. He ended with, "I guess I just need to keep proving myself." I almost repeated the same poison I was given. It's amazing how old scripts survive in your mouth. Instead, I asked him to pull up his calendar and walk me through his week. We looked at every recurring meeting, every rescue request, every report he touched that nobody senior ever read. Then I asked him to list the work tied directly to decisions leadership cared about. The silence told him everything. What I believed then, back in my 30s, was that being the most dependable person made me the obvious choice. What I understand now is it often makes you the most convenient choice. Convenient people get protected, but they also get parked. Companies don't always do this maliciously. Sometimes they just keep using what works. If you keep saying yes without direction, they'll keep aiming you at whatever hurts. I told Ethan something I wish someone had told me with more honesty. Reliability is your reputation. It is not your strategy. He wrote it down. Then I gave him practical steps, not motivational speeches. Stop taking work that has no sponsor. Speak in the room, not just in follow-up emails. Track outcomes in business language. Ask for scope before title and title before burnout. Make your manager define what advancement actually requires. If they can't define it, that's data. He looked relieved and annoyed at the same time. I understood both. Relief because the problem finally had a shape. Annoyance because the shape meant he had to change, not just wait. That conversation spread further than I expected. Over the next year, I had versions of it with 3 more people. I also had to have a harder version with myself when I noticed I still slipped into old habits under stress. Big quarter? I'd start rescuing. Leadership pressure? I'd start over-explaining. The old wiring never vanishes completely. You just catch it faster. By then, the title mattered less to me than the pattern. I had spent half a career learning how to be useful, and the other half learning how not to disappear. That second education was the expensive one, and it made me look at all those safe years with a different kind of grief. Segment 8. Word count 514. Character count 2,786. I retired at 63, and the box they gave me was smaller than I expected. A few notebooks, a framed photo, a mug from a leadership retreat I barely remembered, and a crystal thing with my name engraved on it. The office looked the same on my last day as it had on thousands of ordinary days. Fluorescent lights, low carpet hum, people moving too fast with laptops open. It struck me how much of my life had happened in rooms built to be forgettable. People said generous things. Some of them were true. They talked about my calm under pressure, the teams I built, the clients I saved, the steadiness. I appreciated it. I also noticed what nobody could give back. The years I spent waiting for permission instead of participating in my own career. The dinners I missed while proving things to people who barely remember those quarters. The confidence I postponed because I thought responsibility meant self-erasure. What I believed then, when I was young and scared and trying to be a good man, was that keeping my head down would protect my family and eventually reward me. What I understand now is that protection without direction becomes a trap. My family did need me to be reliable. They also needed me to be present, honest, and brave enough to stop trading my life for praise. After retirement, I found an old legal pad in a garage cabinet with notes from that HR workshop years earlier. The page was yellowing, but one line was still there in heavy pen marks. Are you carrying work that proves your value to you, but not to the people who decide your future? I sat on a step stool in the garage and laughed out loud when I read it. Then I got quiet. That question wasn't just about work anymore. It fit almost everything. The ways I stayed silent to look mature, the ways I performed strength instead of asking for help, the ways I kept doing what I was good at long after it stopped serving the life I said I wanted. If I could speak to the man by the copier at 32, I wouldn't tell him to be louder or ruthless or fake. I'd tell him something simpler and harder. Be reliable, yes, but decide what your reliability is for. Let it build a life, not just a reputation. Let people trust your work. but make sure they can also see your direction. Don't hand them your best years and call it patience. The career advice failed me because I followed half of it and turned it into a rule. The half I missed was this: steadiness matters most when it's attached to a claim on your time, a claim on your future, a claim on the kind of man you're becoming. I learned that late. Late is still better than never. And if there's any comfort in the cost, it's this: once I finally stopped disappearing at work, I stopped disappearing in the rest of my life too.